All right, I'll start. So, hi everyone. I'm Molly Jane, one of the ACJR co-founders and opinion editor at Blockworks. And I'm just here to introduce our panel, which is going to be an ACJR panel about Bitcoin ordinals. So moderating today will be Will Foxley, who's a co-host of The Hash, and he's also media director at Compass Mining. He comes from CoinDesk, where he was a tech reporter, and he also worked for Messari and American Spectator. We have Elizabeth with us, who is currently a data journalist at CoinDesk, who reports on DeFi, exchanges, altcoins, Web3, and she's previously covered technology and business for NBC News and CBS News. And then last on our panel is Pete Rizzo, also a co-founder of the ACJR, editor of Bitcoin Magazine, and editor-in-large at Kraken. So I will let you guys all take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, definitely a great subject, timely. Ordinals has sort of brought back more energy and interest in Bitcoin over the last few months, especially after it's like such a terrible bear market and bottom back in November, specifically for like the Bitcoin mining community, which I'm mainly tapped into. There's just been like a nice breath of fresh air because Bitcoin mining can get pretty stale. It's all like energy markets and buying ASICs, and that's about it. And now we have this whole thing called Ordinals. Obviously, kind of comes off the tailwinds of the NFT markets with Ethereum, which, as we'll get into, there's a lot of differences between Ethereum NFTs and Bitcoin Ordinals. But at the same time, you still have like this very passionate community, and NFTs are starting to move over into the Ordinal space. So I guess that's kind of the place to start. Pete, I think like natural just to move over to you, talking about like the beginning of it. How have you, from your purview, like kind of seen ordinals pop up, and how have you seen it pop up in like within the Bitcoin community? Really beginning in January, if you have any like thoughts on like Casey Rodemore and beginning of ordinals as well for the last 18 months, that'd be probably of interest for the crowd.
Yeah, sure. I can just hop in there. So obviously Bitcoin, a unique kind of development community with a unique ethos, right? So I think Ordinals really came out in January with a big bang in terms of being something that was new and innovative. So it was released, we saw, 1 million inscriptions probably within the first couple months, but really a widespread conversation thereafter about, what the implications of Ordinals were for the Bitcoin network, right? So something that's kind of a differentiator between Bitcoin and the other, kind of cryptocurrency systems is that, within Bitcoin, it really is possible for something to come out and just be like really emergent and different that really wasn't even on the development roadmap, right? So you kind of saw this immediate fissure in the community where, someone who was self-motivated, a fan of kind of what was going on in the cryptocurrency world with NFTs, kind of saw that and, created a new way, and we can get into the kind of specifics of like how Ordinals works because it's pretty complicated and interesting, to kind of store arbitrary data within the Bitcoin network, and this allowed for the creation of digital artifacts kind of in a similar fashion as NFTs. But yeah, the initial conversation really emerged around that developer focal point, right? Because I think within Bitcoin, you sort of have a core development community that is kind of working on the core mission, which is making Bitcoin kind of the best money on the planet, ensuring the updates are secure, efficient. And then we saw someone kind of come out of the blue with just something that was new and innovative, but importantly, kind of work within the consensus rules of Bitcoin, right? So this was something that not everyone had to adopt, but a lot of people did adopt. And so you immediately sort of had the conversation about, whether this was good for Bitcoin, all right? And I think this is always kind of one of the distinctions I draw between Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrency ecosystems is within Bitcoin, you do have this kind of vibrant culture and history of kind of minority groups like kind of forming and then, launching software within the platform, and then also kind of forcing other participants to kind of rethink, how they perceive the system itself. So, Bitcoin, decentralized, permissionless, somebody comes out with a new invention or a new way of doing things, that causes a lot of discussion because, it pushes other requirements on people running the system, right? So essentially, you have this blockchain, this commons that everyone is running. And, one of the kind of things that was really a media discussion point was just the additional data that is coming out of the network, right? So we've seen for 3 months now that Bitcoin has kind of handled and processed the additional data from these NFTs. Some people have, had their concerns mitigated, but yeah, I mean, really, I think initially what you were speaking to is really there was a lot of discussion, and I can speak more, I guess, to why that discussion took place. But yeah, immediately this was kind of a debate, but it wasn't a debate about a proposal. It was a debate about a real protocol. And I think that made it really interesting I think we've seen, that debate still going on today. So I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I'm going to hand it off to Elizabeth and sort of just dovetailing off what you're saying there. Similar question. Ethereum NFTs moving into Bitcoin ordinals. What have you seen from like speaking with like the early participants in Bitcoin ordinals? Is it a crossover, similar crowd, and how are they thinking about like the tech that they're interfacing with?
I mean, I think it depends. I think that there's certainly been a divide in the community of people who are, more receptive to the ordinals and less receptive. Again, like Pete said, I think that some people are just, embracing it, pushing the technology, and the other people who are falling behind, who are, not as interested in it, might still have to at some point adapt, because right now we're seeing the ordinals are taking off. But I think in terms of the impact it will have in the community, we really have to see where this goes. I think it's maybe too early to tell. I mean, it all really depends on, again, whether this is really a trend, whether we see this taking off and bringing Bitcoin beyond its current incarnation,
Gotcha. Yeah, some of the early tech stuff has been interesting to me, and I think we should go back to like some of the other points in a second here. But one thing to bring up is like the similarity for using both products, right? So if anyone's using MetaMask, like just have to download on Chrome or Brave or whatever, and then you have the
if I may, I guess I'd like to jump in like with some of the immediate kind of reception of why people who were kind of more negative on NFTs embraced ordinals, because there are actually some like technical design specifics of ordinals that are worth mentioning. So, think of myself as someone who was, maybe a bit more dismissive of kind of the NFT craze on Ethereum of, 2020 to 2022. I think a lot of people who from the Ethereum crowd, they have this perception of Bitcoin as being like this stodgy ecosystem that just like doesn't want to do certain things. When really, I think there's more of an emphasis on certain things like consumer protection and, just in terms of like figuring out how the software works and runs, right? So we saw in Ethereum, a lot of the NFT ecosystem, they're storing this data on IPFS, they're storing it on kind of like third-party websites. I think Moxley from Signal kind of wrote about the phenomenon where people were buying NFTs. They were thinking that they had the cryptographic keys to this digital property that didn't exist. So, I think it's important to note that ordinals really, within the NFT ecosystem, and this goes all the way back to kind of 2014 when people were experimenting with NFTs for the first time, it offered new things and it offered specific innovations in the model. So like one, the arbitrary data that is now within the Bitcoin transactions, right? Because you're storing the actual data for the image file in the transactions is stored on the Bitcoin blockchain that all 10,000 Bitcoin nodes run. So there's no kind of questions about data availability on like a third-party website. As long as people will be running Bitcoin, which we assume now, I think most people know that, most people will run Bitcoin till the end of time. So you now have this phenomenon where this digital imagery, this art and data can be stored with that degree of confidence. And I think I would argue that there was not similarly a quality of like any other proposal. Like we simply had not seen that. And I think the second one for me that was really big is that, in this case, this arbitrary data, because it is a part of a real Bitcoin transaction, it has to be backed by some arbitrary amount of Bitcoin. So in this case, you'll see if you buy ordinals in a marketplace, most times you're buying it, you're getting like 10,000 Satoshis, which is the smallest unit of the Bitcoin, right? So there's this other phenomenon here where because of the specific design, people who are buying these NFTs, even if these digital artifacts, ordinals, NFTs go to zero, they become completely worthless, they're still backed by Bitcoin. So it would almost be like if you sold somebody a piece of art in 20 BC, but it was a golden piece of art. So the gold has retained its value over time. So there was a couple like specific things where I think, if Bitcoiners had kind of turned off from the NFT space, like there was a legitimate invention here and a legitimate innovation. And I think, again, it's important to kind of talk about like why this has sort of mainstreamed in Bitcoin to a degree that other like NFT initiatives really haven't, right? And we can talk about Counterparty and you can talk about some of the older attempts there. But yeah, I would argue Ordinals was an invention. It was a design invention by someone who really understood the technology. And the end result of that is I think Ordinals offered a higher degree of consumer protection to the users. You still have all the marketplace issues though, which we can get into, right? And so we've inherited all of those. And I think that's what some people are still kind of frustrated with.
Yeah, there's a few great questions there, including like community reaction to it, because that's maybe something to pick up and we come back to some of the tech topics. Curious in your guys' thoughts about that. Like, why was there such big animus against ordinals at the beginning? Like we had the ordinal disrespector, which is basically people tinkering with their nodes to be able to like see ordinals or inscriptions, I should say, as like spam on the network. And so they wouldn't allow like that transaction to necessarily go through its node. Some pushback there, but then there's also just been like general frustration on Twitter and anger, including from a lot of core developers. How have you guys seen that? Elizabeth, I'll toss it up to you to get your thoughts on it, and Pete.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the major things I was seeing that people were upset about were the rising transaction costs. I mean, obviously, just in general, when block space, is in demand, then users offer, higher transaction fees to have their transactions included in the next block, and then that, inflates the transaction fees, especially during busy periods. So, I mean, with all this activity on the blockchain, with the ordinal inscriptions, you saw that prices were rising and transaction fees were rising, and who wants to pay more money? I think that's one of the major things.
Yeah, I would maybe push back a little bit on that. I think everybody within Bitcoin development who's pretty serious about it understands like fees have to rise over time. Like if you assume that there's going to be billions of people using Bitcoin, then the assumption that developers and most of the community takes is that fees will go up over time. So that's the point of building things like Lightning, is kind of push that innovation elsewhere. But yeah, the legitimate disagreement, and I would say like there's still a legitimate debate to be had about this, is whether Bitcoin is itself a network where we can or should store arbitrary data on it. So again, you have to go back to within Bitcoin design. Like one of the things that separates us from other cryptocurrencies is that we want to be using Bitcoin for like hundreds of years. So okay, if you accept that as like the first principle, then it's actually incumbent that the blockchain be small. Right. So this is something that we've heard a lot in Bitcoin over the years. This goes back to kind of the fork wars in 2016, 17 were fought over this. There's this idea that, in order to protect Bitcoin, the innovation is that everybody has to be able to download and run the software. And then their ability to download and run the software is going to be proportional to the overall size of the chain. So the Ordinals actually does have a meaningful impact. And so I'll break down the pros and cons on this. So there's this faction, I think, that wants to always reduce the amount of data that is in the blockchain because it keeps running a node and kind of processing Bitcoin, open and accessible. And then I think there's this sort of, and this was certainly like evident in Casey Rodamar's like thinking about it, where, if you assume certain factors of the network, right, you assume that there's a 4 megabyte block limit, that sort of infers that there is a community consensus and that the social contract of the users is that we can be and should be storing up to 4 megabytes of data per block. And that if we don't do that, there isn't anything good or bad. You can't draw like sort of a moral conclusion to it, right? So what Casey's argument was essentially like, we've all agreed to store 4 megabytes per block forever. And we're not doing that right now. So I'm creating another way to do that. And therefore I haven't broken any of the rules. And so this was sort of, this was kind of the real fissure point of the debate, because if you do look at the UTXO size and the blockchain size, how fast these things are growing, there is like a noticeable uptick because of Ordinals, right? Because we are now storing these image files and this image data. I would argue the Ordinals innovation community has like tried to drive that down and has done like a fairly good job over the last couple of months. But again, you end up with this sort of divide where it's like, I think you have, people who really want Bitcoin to be money and like really just laser focus on that. And there's people who want Bitcoin to be an immutable database that is used for things beyond money, including other assets. So this has sort of reignited that conversation. And I would argue that this has been an inherent sort of like fissure point in Bitcoin development and what we should, as humans, should do with Bitcoin for forever. And, you can go back to like one of the reasons Ethereum was kind of created, was the assumption that, Bitcoin maybe wouldn't follow the path of kind of storing all this data on its blockchain. So, that's a nuanced debate, but I think it really kind of revolves around, how should developers, builders, and users like advocate for block space to be used? And then based on how we advocate for that block space to be used, what does that mean about Bitcoin succeeding on its mission, which is like being money for, 8 billion people?
So one thing I want to slightly push back on as well, and kind of get your thoughts on it, is like this mushy middle that's actually okay with being very pragmatic about Bitcoin having one use case and Bitcoin being only money and Bitcoin only having so much data in a block. And then the other side, which is like financializing Bitcoin with all these different tokens and things like that. I think there's been some people who've been like BRC20s are stupid. We shouldn't be pushing for them. And what Casey did mattered, but we should be like focusing on the inscription thing and not be like pushing for like stuff that doesn't necessarily make sense. And so for background,
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to talk about that, BRC is like a, specific thing where you can argue from like a data use perspective, it was really wasteful. I would kind of scrub that away because it's almost not worth talking about. I think, what will be worth talking about is there will be different token protocols launched on Bitcoin. So some of these have already been in development from Bitcoin's, core developer set. So like, the Taproot assets, which was Taro a couple of years ago, you have, RGB, which is like another like token proposal. So my argument, and I made this as far back as last year, is I think Bitcoin is going to go in a direction where we have to answer this question of will there be tokens on Bitcoin, and will the Bitcoin economy, accommodate them? And because of that, will the Bitcoin economy become competitive with other assets? So I almost like to kind of reframe this whole issue, where I think a lot of people myopically kind of talk about Bitcoin now doing NFTs. I really think what we're looking at right now is that, since 2017, we've had this idea that there are crypto assets. There's the unique cryptocurrencies, and they differentiate on features, right? That's why why do we have many different crypto assets? Well, because they all have different features. This was kind of always a really crazy framing because it really always broke down when you looked at the specifics. So now you're looking at multiple blockchains, multiple cryptocurrencies that are competing on features, that are competing for markets. I actually think that if you're like meta interested in cryptocurrencies, like even beyond Bitcoin, like the fascinating thing that's really happening with Ordinals is that it broke this like conception window that I think was wrong. And it's like, what's happening now is that the Bitcoin economy is competing for one of the largest Ethereum economies. So you're basically watching like two countries like war for some sort of market. You can talk about whether the validity of the market or like, what the long-term use case is, but we've clearly like entered a new era. And I think the new era that we're in now is essentially like, if Bitcoin can become a competitive platform, it's already the preferred money. I don't think anybody's going to look at the 14 years of data of Bitcoin being the most valuable cryptocurrency and so that it, hasn't won that race. If it now starts competing against Ethereum and these other things as a platform, I think you have to start questioning a lot of the design decisions that a lot of these other blockchains have made. I think that's where you get into kind of the interesting discussions about like tokens and things like that. But yeah, I would maybe pause it there and just say like, I think what we're looking at now is that blockchains and cryptocurrencies are really kind of misclassified. We really should be thinking of them as competing economies. It's happening with Ordinals, like on the NFT market, but I think because of that, it's going to happen in other markets. I think you're going to see it in stable coins. I think you're going to see it in DeFi. And I think the Bitcoin community at large is starting to get activated to this idea of, okay, can we be more militant, I guess, in, competing for these economies, competing against, where they have been successful. I think that'll be interesting to see.
Elizabeth, any like follow up on that?
I mean, at this point, no, I think you're definitely taking it in a different direction. What I was thinking of, Ordinals being a new technology, and then how does that affect like what regulatory implications does that have? But I think maybe we might want to revisit that later on in the discussion, or I don't know if you want me to dive into that now, because that was another thing.
The regulatory stuff is interesting. I mean, my argument, I think, is that the lack of regulatory clarity for other cryptocurrencies is going to force a lot of this activity around Ordinals and, applications that use Bitcoin's block space. But I'm interested, since it sounds like you're more plugged into the Ethereum community, that I'd be interested in your take.
I guess I'm just wondering, I'm wondering how regulators would perceive the Ordinals, right? Like whether they're classified as a security or not, because it seems like it can kind of move between being like a fungible token and a non-fungible, like digital art, like digital art assets. So it's
that's
like
why a lot of this conversation around this stuff has always been so poor, because there isn't really, I think like you have to go back to the initial sort of assertion that like cryptocurrencies like compete on features, that is the thing that they do. So therefore we have to class them by their characteristics, which are like sort of immutable or fixed. And so I think what's interesting about Ordinals is that I think people who really follow development like always knew that this was a really stupid lens. Like it really never made any sense. And I think now that we're seeing that that's not the case, so like, let's take a hypothetical, right? So let's just say like the US environment for crypto assets continues to be really poor, right? And you say, okay, well, Bitcoin is not a security. So maybe if we launch our token platform on Bitcoin, it's not a security as well. I think you'll see people try that. I don't think it's correct, because I think, again, like security has like a specific definition as like, are you launching something with the intent of, providing future value and like around this project, right? So but I think it's going to blur the lines. But again, it gets back to like sort of what the inherent thing here that's so difficult is like, you know, what's an NFT or an ordinal at the end of the day? It's a bunch of ones and zeros like connected to a blockchain. So, you know, this is why the regulators have had such a difficulty with it. And this is where I think the ordinals conversation is going to get much more interesting, because I do think that the regulatory crackdown on other crypto assets is going to force this innovation onto Bitcoin because of Bitcoin's perceived regulatory clarity. And then I think you're just going to see some really wild stuff happen. But now we're in like progression. You know,
But then do you think you're going to tread into a zone where there's going to, you know, start to be some ambiguities in that regulatory clarity once you start getting into this new technology, embracing this, you know, these ordinals? You know, because it seems like ordinals are kind of in a class of their own, again, because they could be a fungible token and at the same time, you know, a non-fungible.
I don't really understand your classification, like, to be honest, because I think now we're like sort of in the Ethereum lexicon of like, you know, non-fungible tokens versus fungible tokens. And, you know, are ordinals a fungible token? Like they're a part of a transaction. So they're not.
But I guess it depends on how the user views it, right? Like, are you keeping it as an NFT or are you, you know, using it to, you
like,
know,
if people made the argument that NFTs are securities, is that like a real argument that anyone's like taking seriously at any level? Like, that's
no, well, that's what I'm saying, that if it's not, you know, are you going to treat it like a regular token and say that it's a security, or are you going to say it's an NFT, it's not a token, it's not a security? And does that depend on, like, what does that depend on, right? Like if it can morph between.
Well, I would argue BRC20 tokens are inherently securities because they have the same properties as any.
And what about like image-based inscriptions?
Well, but again, like with the image-based inscription, like you are taking a piece of you're taking like an image file, you're inserting it into a transaction, and then someone is buying the private keys like for that data, right? So like that, so to have access to that data within the Ordinals protocol. So if you accept any world in which there's like NFTs, general NFTs are not securities. I don't see how they could be by any rational definition, because they're individual units. Your argument that because, I think I see what you're saying, but I would argue that
like divorcing its utility, you know, and its market value from its face
Really
value.
quick, can we get some definitions for people who are familiar with BRC20s, inscriptions, the difference between the two things, and perhaps how BRC20s are fundamentally different?
Yeah, so Ordinals was a protocol that like you know, essentially did a couple things. Like, so it took the 21 million Bitcoin and established an arbitrary order for them. So like 1 through 21 million. So basically what the Ordinals protocol does at a high level is it just takes all the Ordinals, it takes all the Bitcoin ever, all the 21 million, and just numbers them. And then once it established, you know, the people who are running that software, they have a consensus on this like ordering of the Bitcoins. It allows you to associate and view arbitrary data, you know, with those transactions. So you essentially can, you know which Bitcoin you own, which in Bitcoin is impossible, right? So because in Bitcoin, whenever you create a transaction, you're creating an UTXO and that's destroyed. And so Bitcoin has, this is where you're getting now into like the super weeds, but like Bitcoin has as a software, Bitcoin knows what Satoshis are. It actually only knows what Satoshis are. It doesn't actually have a concept of a Bitcoin in the way that we think about it. It only knows there's 2.1 quadrillion like Satoshis. That's the numeraire of the Bitcoin network. And so what the Ordinals protocol does is it takes that assumption, takes the 21 million, and then it orders them, and then it allows you to kind of associate attributes with those things within this consensus, and then to you know, associate data with them. So at a high level, that's what Ordinals is. BRC20 is a token protocol that is built on top of Ordinals that allows you to essentially issue like bulk, you know, tokens, like say like you wanted to issue like 20,000 shares of something. And then it allows people to essentially like mint or like create those tokens and therefore claim ownership to them. So it essentially takes what Ordinals does. And then this is why this is the real answer. I think I was trying to answer Elizabeth's question, is because like, the BRC20 standard is these are all protocols for data. The way that the specific BRC20 protocol behaves is it takes the ordinals that it creates, it makes a large set of them, and it allows you to kind of use them as like individual tokens, of which all of them are sort of the same, right? You're creating like a new set of assets, and then you know, doing whatever you would do with like a new set of money or a new set of financial, you know, products. You're not like, so it's different than ordinals. You're not creating like, it's essentially no different than like if you were to go into Ethereum and create a contract that says I want to make 20,000 X coins. and then, issue those X coins. The difference is that the end user mints them. You could argue that that's semantically different. I would probably argue that's not, but I don't know if this is helpful or not.
No, I think that background's really helpful. And sort of sets the stage for like going back to the regulatory question, which Elizabeth, as I understood it, you were basically sort of asking the point of like what's going to be a security and what's not. And Pete, I think like the point you were making is like Bitcoin can just be like a financial platform for the first time by like really leaning into ordinals or some of the other platforms you're talking about. I think one thing that's sort of interesting here is talking about like how tokens can be securities, and kind of comes down to like,
yeah, I want to understand Elizabeth's point about non-fungible tokens versus fungible tokens, because I don't understand that, because this is always my bothersome thing with like kind of the Ethereum lexicon, is it creates this kind of obfuscation around like, at the end of the day, these are just like strings of letters and numbers, like however you want to slice it. So like what's your view on that? Because I guess my view would be like it's the actions of the people and what they do with it that actually makes it a security or not, and not like inherently with like in the protocol.
Yeah,
I guess like on the view.
Yeah,
I can go really quickly. Actually, Elizabeth, you go first.
Oh no, Will, you go first, actually.
Well, I think I agree with Pete. Like all the different token standards, like ERC20, ERC 721, and there's some other ones are coming out. They're all just like basically around like how the protocol interacts with a certain token, and then really how the end user interacts with that token, right? And so like as a security provider, or as like the SEC, like why would they really care about that? They probably don't.
Let's like go with like a meta experiment, right? Like, so Bitcoin is a software that anyone can fork. It's still open source, same as it was in 2009. So I can create a new set of Bitcoins. I can just copy the Bitcoin software, and then I can choose to, give those tokens new attributes, and then I can sell them to investors, and then I can launch that project. So I've taken the Bitcoin code, but I've turned those Bitcoins into securities. They are securities based on like what I am doing to release those assets like into the world, and based on the end contract that I have with the investors who are buying them. So they're not inherently securities because they're the same code that Bitcoin used. So again, there's I think this divorce between like, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is just a bunch of ones and zeros. NFTs are the same, right? A lot of these are standards for how that data is read. So I think you can look at examples where, the definition of what is a security, should be really tightly to like what the issuer and like the end users like expectations like of that thing are, right? I think once you start getting into like, and this is the problem with a lot of like the recent regulatory stuff of like, this cryptocurrency is that, and this cryptocurrency is this, is it's like based on this like somewhat flawed assumption that these systems are not going to change or like be different or like can't be used in different ways. And I think that's just like pretty problematic.
Yeah, no, I think like the tech almost is irrelevant for it. It's all about like the end consumer, what they're purchasing, and the contract, and what the purpose of the issuer of it is, right? So I think like the platform is almost agnostic to it. But Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I see what you guys are saying now. So in other words, you're saying that the issuer necessarily shouldn't bear the responsibility for how the user is using the ordinal, right?
Well, they would be in the sense that they would like, you're whatever the SEC decides, and who are they going to go
Well,
after?
you could take a specific ordinal. So like this is so like I would argue like, let's say you Bitcoin golden frog number 1 or whatever. You take that golden frog and then you use the BRC20 protocol to make tokens that represent shares in that piece of art. Like, and then you sell those shares. Like those would be securities, even though like maybe theoretically they can potentially represent a fraction of like the original kind of like artwork that the person purchased. But like now we're getting like way into the weeds of like blockchain like theoretics. So I don't know how much we want to go there, but I think the meta point is like, there's this kind of foundational assumption that I think drives a lot of this conversation, that like cryptocurrencies have unique features and therefore they can be classed like based on these unique features. And I think like ordinals, like the thing that I actually emphatically love about ordinals, like more than anything else, is it just blew away this like preconception. Like you can go on to like Messari or CoinMarketCap, and it's like they will like label these cryptocurrencies like based on like feature sets and like try to compare them and class them. And I just think this was a totally useless exercise. As a participant in this exercise, we gained absolutely nothing from it. And I think ultimately it has left us with this like really faulty perception that cryptocurrency systems are not, able to change based on like someone's ability to innovate, right? Like, so this is what Casey did that I think was so smart, is like he did something that was previously impossible within Bitcoin. And now everybody within Bitcoin has to reevaluate what Bitcoin is fundamentally. But I would also argue that doesn't happen in other cryptocurrency systems. This is one of the things that like always infuriated me as like a reporter within like a cryptocurrency world. It's like you just simply don't see that kind of. We haven't. I would actually like ask anyone to like name an example of like another cryptocurrency where like somebody like came up with something that like wasn't on their roadmap or like towards their destination, where it was like an emergent thing that then like caused all the participants to like reevaluate what it was.
I think like MEV on Ethereum would fit that, but it would maybe be like a negative, right? So I think there are those things, but
MEV was like an emergent property because like the miners are classed with ordering transactions. So therefore, when you allow a lot of this complex financialization, this was like, I don't know if you follow the drive chains discussion for years, but like a lot of this, this is like, once miners can tell that certain transactions are different than other transactions, they can change their behavior because they're profit motivated. So my understanding was that was just a carryover of that.
Yeah, I think it was like definitely emergent in the way that like some of these things would interact with each other. So like the rise of flash loans and how oracles would work with each other in Ethereum, very much more complex, but I'd say it'd be like a negative. Whereas Bitcoin had this rule set, people thought they understood the rule set. Casey came in and sort of like flipped everything on its head, and everyone had to like re-understand what they unless you guys want to keep going on that track, I kind of want to go back to an earlier question, which is about like how users are interfacing with all these things and how people who are like previously really only into like Ethereum NFTs or Solana NFTs are rediscovering Bitcoin for the first time. And toss it over to Elizabeth, just get some questions in on that. So one place to touch is like MetaMask. Most people have used at this point, and people are now onboarding onto Bitcoin wallets, browser wallets like Unisat. There's a few others out there, of course. Have you come across anyone you're reporting that's been like, previously a huge Ethereum bull or Solana bull for NFT specifically, but is like now becoming very interested in Bitcoin because of Ordinals? I think you're on mute. Sorry.
So I was going to say, when this was really taking off, I had actually just gone from covering altcoins to covering U.S. courts. So I was not speaking with as many community members about, embracing, the Bitcoin blockchain, coming from somewhere place like, Solana, for instance. But I can imagine that that's happening as, some of these other protocols are saying are, dying out. Like we've seen Solana tank recently, and while some people are still bullish on it, you've seen like a lot of dissatisfaction with Solana. So I can imagine people migrating to Bitcoin where the community is a lot more bullish, and the ties that unite them are a lot stronger, it seems, from the impression that I got, at least when I went to Bitcoin Miami.
Yeah, I can take that. I would say like, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that, convinced me to like kind of reevaluate my position on Ordinals, or just the idea of NFTs coming to Bitcoin, was just seeing the influx of people coming in like initially. So like, the first week of February, you kind of flashback, Ordinals is happening. People are starting to get pretty pissed. I went into the Discords and I was just like, okay, I'm going to like see what's going on. I'm going to join all the ones I can. I joined 200 Discords in the first week. There was probably between 100 and 1,500 people in there. And I think that's where I really got a sense of like, just how big the Ethereum market for NFTs was, right? Like, because I think a lot of the people who are in Ordinals right now, I don't think these are Bitcoin users from like 2019 to like 2022 who embraced Ordinals. These are the kids who were like sitting around all day during college and like flipping Solana NFTs and ETH NFTs. And I think I came away with like really two takeaways, which was one, like, was like, my God, this community is too like really big. And then like two, like they are super agnostic to pretty much everything. I don't think they have any allegiance to any blockchain or any asset. I think they're completely blockchain and currency agnostic. And so when I saw that, I was like, okay, this is going to get really interesting, because you have all these people who are using Bitcoin for the first time. What can Bitcoin Magazine potentially do as a brand, like to educate these people, right? Because essentially, I think that, and this is my area of primary disagreement with a lot of the other Bitcoiners, is I think that say what you will about the Ordinals market or Ordinals is technology, I think there are, thousands of people who are now interested in Bitcoin for the first time. I think it's our responsibility to educate them and get that excitement and enthusiasm into the community. And, one of the arguments that I sort of give is that, you go back to 2013, like Silk Road. Silk Road was a huge thing for Bitcoin. Is Silk Road around anymore? Are dark markets around anymore? No. But a lot of those people still own Bitcoin, and they came to care about Bitcoin, and they came to be prominent members in the community who built useful things. So even in the case where Ordinals is this sort of multi-year fad, NFTs are sort of this POG like digital phenomenon. I think it's sort of incumbent on, maybe this extends to the crypto media as well. It's like, these are people who want to be educated about Bitcoin for the first time, right? They're using wallets. They're doing kind of complex things with like pre-signed Bitcoin transactions and auctions. They're all super fascinating. So I think, there's definitely been a huge outpouring there. I think that some of this tribal lines still exist, right? So the people who are kind of came into like Ethereum in 21, 22, they have Ethereum. They want Ethereum to succeed. The people who have Solana probably want Solana to succeed. But again, I think I would go back to like my meta thing where I tried to kind of reframe the concept on this, which is like, let's imagine these are competing economies now. And the Bitcoin economy now is now getting a new entrance. Like people are fleeing these other cryptocurrencies into Bitcoin. I think that's pretty fascinating, and I think that I like the Ethscription thing. I mean, I think that sort of proves the point. It's like, here it is, the Ethereum community firing back with their attempt to get these users back to them. So now we have sort of the turf war between these chains. But again, I think you're ultimately just left with a more interesting model of like what cryptocurrencies are. Does the end user care? No, but I would argue from the blockchain builders / industry perspective, like it absolutely matters like where people are building these things and like where they're doing what they're doing with them, right? Like, so would I prefer that someone uses Bitcoin to Solana? Like, of course, Solana is like a massively chain where they took tons of tokens and they sold them all to VCs, and it's predominantly owned by the meme of like the VCs exiting to based on 18-year-olds dollars. So yeah, I think like Solana is like a predatory system, right? We should want people to move away from them. But then on the sort of like crypto reporter level, like cryptocurrency media level, it's like we have to be advocates for like consumer protection on some level. This was the whole debate during 2017 and sort of the ICO craze, right? Where it's like, what degree is like cryptocurrency media like responsible for consumer protection, and like, are we going to take that mandate seriously? I think the people who were around at that time, there was a lot of ways to get easy page views off, Joe Schmo blockchain raising $200 million from venture co and friends, right? There was every day there, and a lot of those things don't work anymore. The people invested a lot of money in them and they lost a lot of money. So I think you have to go back to that responsibility thing. I would like for Ordinals to engage more of the cryptocurrency media to like really start I think digging more into like, okay, the differences between the blockchains matter, how we think about blockchains matters, and we spend a lot of time on these like distracting meta questions about like the NFT market and like who uses them. But I think a lot of the more fascinating stuff is at the sub layer. It's like how are we classifying the industry, and then how are we portraying it? Because I think the argument that I've made is that agnosticism is a lens. If we are agnostic to blockchains and we don't care about what blockchains people are using, then the world won't care about that either. When I think that is, Ordinals really shows that is something we should care about. If it is possible to do something in a better way, where the end user has more consumer protections, where they have more protections than doing it somewhere else, that is something that we should advocate for anyway, because it's core to our mandate as the crypto media. It's like we have to be biased towards that. And I think I'd like to introduce this sort of like agnosticism versus consumer protection thing, because I think it can help re-engage people on this issue, because I think it's tempting to like turn off from like the technical minutia of it. I'll stop there.
No, that was great. One thing I want to go back to and toss to Elizabeth is like the bringing these two different groups together. I kind of think of it like a freshwater river and and we have like Ordinals and this new group of like Ethereum NFT people, Solana NFT people jumping in from Discord channels, and like Pete was saying, like college kids flipping JPEGs. And then we have like somewhat old guard people from 2017, 2018 who are really interested in like the block size wars. And then we also, mostly we have a lot of people from like 2020 COVID time who are on Clubhouse talking about Bitcoin and really getting into Bitcoin with like only eating steak, right? And like these two very different groups merging together now. From a cultural, how do we like report on this well? And how do you like speak about these two communities coming together?
I mean, it's tough, right? Because, well, I mean, I think what I would pose another question to your question is, so basically, I think that, you know, there's a little bit, should we be asking you if we can bring the communities together? I think that honestly, it's not our job as journalists to, you know, help those two communities engage with one another. I think it's more about, you know, asking the question of, you know, do these communities want to be educated? And if so, or, you know, how do we go about educating them, which I think is what, you know, Pete was getting at. And that's something I actually do wonder about, you know, if people who are looking to make a quick buck, you know, flipping JPEG, how are they going to, you know, how receptive are they going to be to our efforts to educate them? Like, I think you can, so I think, yeah, we could try to, you know, put out more educational materials about, you know, what are ordinals, and, you know, we can try to, you know, engage more with that ecosystem. But I just feel like,
yeah,
bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? So I mean, like, yeah, we should be thinking about consumer protection. We should be thinking about, you know, speaking to this community, engaging with it because they've been around for a while, and, you know, it certainly is, yeah, less predatory than other blockchains. But at the same time, no matter what we do, I mean, you know, I don't know if we can really help those people become entrenched in, you know, this Bitcoin community and really care about it.
I guess one way to also like frame the question, this might be one of the last ones we end on, is like, what is a Bitcoiner now? I think that assumption is being challenged really heavily. I think specifically in crypto media, we've had this idea that like a Bitcoiner is someone who reads the Bitcoin standard, eats meat 3 times a day, and like prays to Satoshi. And that's obviously like a caricature, but it's been something that's been pretty predominant in Twitter culture, but also somewhat in crypto media. Like, it's been representative of who journalists will speak with, what takes they get from certain people. And I can already think of like a handful of stories where
there's like a special jail in hell for like a class of reporting. It's like cryptocurrency culture reporting. I just think that's like the most useless thing. Like,
but it does bleed into everything, right? So like, you'll have a story that's about a shitcoin that goes wrong, and they will always go get the Bitcoiner to comment on it. So how do journalists interact with like this?
Well, again, I go back to like the fundamental debate here, which is like, and I try to introduce this in a lot of conversations I have, is like, you know, how is cryptocurrency journalism like helping people understand the frame or the lens on which they view cryptocurrencies? This is like the primary question. I honestly think that this was prevalent in like early cryptocurrency journalism, and then from the 2020 to like 2022 era, it really died. Like, early cryptocurrency journalism was technology journalism.
Wait, can we define what we mean by cryptocurrency journalism? I mean, especially when we're talking about like 2020 to 2023, like, do we mean anybody who's covering cryptocurrency, or do we mean specifically like reporting that's coming out of crypto trade pubs?
I think the cryptocurrency trade publications, I guess if you want to call them that, were primarily, prior to 2017, like technology publications. Like, they were publications that were focused on like the competition of cryptocurrencies and cryptocurrency ideas, and they assumed that the end reader would knowledgeably participate in that and then navigate that ecosystem. I would argue that like from 2020 on, what happened was there was this perception, again, I would blame a lot of this on the crypto asset thesis, that the crypto markets like were a legitimate thing, that the crypto assets were competing like on feature sets, and therefore like we could have a markets-based conversation about what was happening. So therefore, like, with Dogecoin was going up there, we had to draw some conclusion from that because this was a market and there were rational actors like kind of making choices like within this market. So, you know, if there's something I'm hopeful for, it's that we'll turn away from like that markets-based coverage and maybe go back to something where there's substantive work being done about like the lens with which we look at the industry. Because kind of as I brought it to the, you know, as I said at the beginning, like one of the most fascinating things I think for me to our ordinals is that it really breaks the current conception. Like, you know, and when I say current conception, I think of like the big list of currencies in order on CoinMarketCap. This is just how everybody thinks about the industry, and it's like not the right way to look at it at all. It's a really stupid way to look at it. But this is what we have created as participants in the system. This is what we have created. So what is our stance on that? And I think we have to engage cryptocurrency journalism on that, because I think the more that we are passively kind of like watching what's going on, the less we're engaged on the fundamental issues, the more we lapse into being responsible for some of these things that happen, like with Terra Luna and like, you know, some of the other things. So it's like, what is our culpability in this whole system as stakeholders? I really want to have the end of agnosticism. Like, I think agnosticism got us nowhere. It got us these massive crashes and these like shady companies that were allowed to get like tons of headlines on absolutely nothing. And I get why it happens. I get why it happened, but like we have to come forward from this time period, like in the collapse of FTX, which was a media failure we were all partly responsible for. You know, so how do we move forward from that? I would like to re-engage the community around the technology discussion, because look, I don't think there's any useful thing you can do in like talking about meat eating culture within Bitcoin, or like the age of the average Ethereum participant. I think these are like, you know, these are questions that just like, they don't move the Overton window on any of this stuff at all. They don't add anything meaningful, because I think at the end of the day, like the substrata of the industry is still being figured out. We actually don't really know how the stuff works that to that much of an extent, and like we've allowed people to talk to our readers as experts who really don't know anything. I'm sorry, they don't. Like, a lot of these people are not experts. They don't deserve the platform to talk to people about anything, because they don't actually understand any of this stuff any better than we do. Anyway, I'll stop there. But
well, actually, I would agree with that point. It's interesting you brought that up at the end about, you know, who we defer to when we're looking for experts to talk to and quote in our stories. For instance, I think like a big thing we see this in actually sometimes the tech reporting, or sometimes, you know, if there's like a an exploit on like a DeFi protocol or something like that, we'd call in, like blockchain security experts. But I mean, as you probably know, like security experts are a dime a dozen. Everybody thinks they know what's going on, but that can be very challenging, I think, with, who actually knows this space well enough to be able to comment on it. I do sometimes think that, we have to be more careful about that. In terms of culture reporting, I mean, I think that I think there is space for it.
It's way too dominant. It's like excessively dominant, and it's actually allowed the perception that these cultures like reasonably impact the protocols, which they don't. Then this is the other thing that Ordinals, I think, made very clear, is that if anybody wants to come and make an innovation within Bitcoin and that can respect the rules of the protocol, they can. And it doesn't matter what the participants think, as long as they're following the rules of that protocol. And I continue to say this, that I think the greatest contribution that Casey made was that he did not ask for permission to launch Ordinals. And I think that will have repercussions, because I think other people will look at what he did and they will also not ask permission for what they do on Bitcoin. And I think that's why I would expect a lot of the people who are interested in other cryptocurrencies to take another look at Bitcoin, to look at building things on Bitcoin. And I think, they're going to ask themselves, okay, if I want to build something meaningful that's going to be around in 100 years, or do I want to build the next FTX? Do I want to build the next crypto fund that raises a bunch of money in the bear market and then goes bust? I'm excited to welcome people to that conversation. And, if there's anybody who's interested in Bitcoin, wants to hit me up about specifics of the development ecosystem, I'm always happy to answer questions. But, I think we got to get rid of the Bitcoin and crypto stuff. Like we got this artificial thing that happened. I don't know when it happens.
But you mean that like people saying that Bitcoin is diametrically opposed to, crypto?
All right. Like memes are helpful at certain times and they become unhelpful. I think like the Bitcoin and crypto thing was very useful for its time, because it is very true that Bitcoin is a separate development ecosystem and philosophy than the cryptocurrency space. They actually are two cultures that can be classed and described and compared in a truly meaningful way. But I would say that the caveat I have to that is that there's nothing that limits anybody from doing anything that has happened on another cryptocurrency from doing that on Bitcoin, other than their own ability to innovate within the framework of Bitcoin. And that has always been the case. I think what we saw with Ordinals is we saw somebody really do it for the first time in a really meaningful way. And again, going back to kind of some of these differences, there is no Ordinals token. There's no Ordinals Foundation. There's no Casey Rodomar, CEO of Ordinals Protocol and Inc. that raised $100 million. There's a guy who launched a piece of software. He launched it for free for everybody. And I think you ask why Bitcoiners didn't support NFTs and all these other things before, because we had never seen something that had the qualities and the design framework that he presented. And I think the people who are building on other cryptocurrencies, they need to look at what he did. They need to study like how he built what he built and why the culture was willing to look at it and give it the chance that it deserves because it was well designed. Because I firmly believe that there's nothing stopping anybody in this whole space from doing something of a similar caliber. And I think they should be encouraged to do so. Because I think at the end of the day, if you are able to take something that exists elsewhere in the cryptocurrency space and you're able to improve it meaningfully within Bitcoin, I think that should be championed, even if you disagree with it. I think it was a really interesting thing. And I would rather we spend more time talking about that than sort of, what it means for NFT markets and NFT platforms. These are people just selling things and they're making money off transaction fees. They don't have anything meaningful to say like on this topic.
So we got to wrap up here. Let's just finish with one question from the chat, which I think you guys both would be interested in, which is just talking about FTX. So Christy asks, FTX was brought down by investigative journalism. To what extent do we have the resources and depth of knowledge in crypto journalism to expose more crypto's problems?
Well, when I was at CoinDesk, it was me and another guy at a desk. And now there's, 70, 80 people, 100 people. So they're always going to be overwhelmed with stuff. But, I think that, the first thing is to just be inherently skeptical, right? That's the one thing where you think, I wish more crypto journalists were always more like Bitcoin maximalists. Why? Because the Bitcoin maximalists are skeptical of everything. And they spend all day like talking about why things should be better or like why they're not good.
And I could speak to that actually in terms of, I can speak to that in terms of, how, some of these crypto publications hire. I think they have trouble sometimes striking the balance between finding the people that understand the tech, that, are interested in the markets, that can do that kind of coverage, and then finding people, who have a handle on, the ethical implications of like how to report out a piece, which tend to be people who are coming from like a mainstream media background who don't have that depth of knowledge about crypto. And I think we need to find a way to bridge those two skill sets, right? Like understanding how to report out a story ethically and, how to remain at least, somewhat objective. And then at the same time, how to promote more understanding of, the crypto industry and the different, communities that operate within it. And that's really tough. And I think also there's a lot of noise right now, which makes it difficult, or at least in the bull market, there's a lot of like noise that made it very difficult, right? Because like we, you had like a lot of people just like pumping out press releases 24/7. And like a lot of publications, I think were just rewriting the press releases and putting them out because they were getting clicks. And I think now during this bear market, the one good thing about it is that we have time to kind of sit back and think, okay, like what do we really want to talk about now? The only issue, of course, though, is the issue of, funding and everything as well. I think, how our media in general has, like an issue, making money and paying, journalists for what they're worth. And I think that that's something we have to look at, how that impacts crypto publications and how it plays out there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just my 2 cents, I think, is the press releases is a huge thing. People just push press releases out the door. A lot of the media sites aren't incentivized to train journalists correctly to like learn how to do things. And like, you don't have to push the story out every day. Maybe one a week is fine because you're actually reporting a story with authenticity. And then like, I think microsites are also very important in this industry. Like there's a decent amount of microsites in traditional media as well. So like a few people focusing on a very specific industry, learning in depth. And I'd love to see more of that within crypto, specifically for Ordinals. So I hope maybe an Ordinals publication pops up. Let's close it out there. I'll hand the conversation back to everyone at ACJR. But again, thanks for joining, Pete and Elizabeth.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys all so much. I'll just give the typical shout out at the end. If you follow the ACJR on Twitter, in our monthly newsletter, co-written by myself and Anthony Mandela, you also can become an actual card-carrying member of the ACJR if you're a journalist for just $25 a year. You can reach out to myself or Joyce, and then also just stay in touch with us on social media to find more webinars, more meetups, etc. Joyce, you can add anything I've forgotten.
No, that's good. And thanks to everyone. Thanks to our panel and thanks for tuning in. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, guys.
Um,
Bye.